I just got done researching everything Islam teaches about Mary, and I gotta say, as a Christian, I'm shocked. I'm shocked by how much we agree, but I'm also shocked that in the ways that we significantly disagree, it's ultimately rooted in our differences in belief about Jesus. Muslims will often say that they agree with us on many things about Jesus. For example, that he's the Messiah, that he did a lot of miracles and all these things. But they tend to really downplay the differences that we have, namely in that Christians affirm that he is actually God in the flesh, that he died for our sins on the cross, and that he rose on the third day. Muslims reject all these things, but they'll still say that we agree on so much about Jesus. But one of the areas that doesn't get covered enough, in my opinion, is how much we agree on about Mary, and how really the ways that we differ in our Mariology are rooted in the ways that we differ in our Christology. What we believe about Jesus is ultimately going to influence what we believe about Mary, and vice versa. What we believe about Mary is going to influence what we believe about Jesus. So what I want to do in this video is talk about what Muslims believe about Mary, where those beliefs come from, and how those are similar to or different from Christian beliefs about Mary. To give just a little bit of backstory, at the time and place where Islam originated, there were many different Christian sects, some of which were heretical. For example, there were the Nestorians in 7th century Arabia, who believed that Jesus is made up of two persons, one divine and one human. There's also the Miaphysites, who believe that Jesus is fully divine and fully human, but only has one nature. Historic traditional Christianity teaches that Jesus is one person made up of two natures, one of those natures being human, one of those natures being divine, yet both of those making up one person, as was defined in the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD. But not all of the Christians in 7th century Arabia were heretical. There were also Chalcedonian Christians and Byzantine Christians in the area as well. And despite the theological diversity that existed in Christianity at the time, at least in 7th century Arabia, they actually largely agreed when it came to Mary. So for example, it was pretty much unanimous that Mary was a virgin when Jesus was conceived and born. It was also nearly unanimous that she remained a virgin for the rest of her life. Most Christians accepted that she was the Theotokos, or God-bearer, or mother of God, except for Nestorians, like I mentioned earlier, who were condemned in the Council of Ephesus in 431. They preferred to call her the mother of Christ, saying that she was only the mother of his human nature, not his divine nature. But as the Council of Ephesus pointed out, you can't separate Jesus into two persons. Both of these natures are combined in one person, and that one person is the Son of Mary. And lastly, on the Immaculate Conception, while many Christians did believe from early on that Mary was uniquely holy from conception, the idea of the Immaculate Conception, i.e. that she was conceived without original sin, hadn't been thoroughly formulated or dogmatically defined by the 7th century, so it's safe to say there was probably a diversity of opinion on this as well in 7th century Arabia. Now, the reason that all of this matters is that some scholars reason the similarities between Islam and some of these heretical Christians in the 7th century Arabia point to how Islam is possibly an outgrowth of heretical Christianity, because they believe, like the Arians did, that Jesus is not God, and they would agree at least partly with the Nestorians in rejecting Mary's title as Mother of God. But now that we have the backdrop out of the way, let's talk about what Muslims today believe about Mary by looking to the Qur'an and the Hadith. And we'll start with the clearest area of agreement, which is the virgin birth of Jesus. Surah Al-Maryam verses 20 through 21 says, quote, "She said, 'How can I have a son when no mortal hath touched me, neither have I been unchaste?' He said, 'So it will be. Thy Lord saith, It is easy for me, and it will be that we make of him a revelation for mankind, and a mercy from us, and it is a thing ordained.'" This is clearly a parallel to the gospel narratives of the virgin birth. For example, Luke chapter 1 verses 34 through 35, which say, quote, "Mary said to the angel, 'How can this be, since I am a virgin?' The angel said to her, 'The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be holy. He will be called the Son of God.'" Now, of course, while both of these narratives pretty much affirm the same thing, that Jesus was born of a virgin, the Quran would reject what the angel Gabriel says in Luke when he calls Jesus the Son of God. In fact, the Quran says, "May Allah destroy those who say that God has sons." However, the Gospels and every Christian from the 1st century onward has always considered Jesus to be the Son of God and to be God himself. Next, what really shocked me was that the Quran seems to affirm a sort of Immaculate Conception of Mary. As a reminder, the Immaculate Conception is the teaching that Mary was conceived without original sin. Whereas everybody is born with the original sin inherited from Adam and Eve, Mary and Jesus are the only ones to be conceived without that original sin. Jesus, because he is God in the flesh, therefore he cannot have original sin, and Mary, because she was made perfect from conception so that she could house God in her womb for 9 months. And like I said, the Quran seems to affirm a version of the Immaculate Conception, and I only say a version of it because they don't actually believe in original sin. Whereas Christians believe everybody is conceived with the stain of original sin, the stain of what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden in disobeying God. And therefore we are born with an inclination to sin, known as concupiscence. Islam actually teaches somewhat of the opposite. It teaches that we are born with the inclination to submit to God. This is what is called in Islam fitra, which can be seen as the inverse or opposite of the Christian idea of concupiscence, the natural inclination to turn away from God and towards sin. Yet, even without the doctrine of original sin, Islam still seems to affirm that Mary was purified and that she was protected from Satan in a very unique way. For example, Surah Ali Imran, verse 42 says, quote, "And when the angel said, O Mary, lo, Allah hath chosen thee and made thee pure, and hath preferred thee above all the women of creation." Now, I don't know about you, but it's nearly impossible for me to read that and not be reminded of Luke chapter 1, verse 28, which says, quote, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." Or in the same chapter, verse 42, when Elizabeth says to Mary, quote, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." Now, interestingly, in Luke chapter 1, verse 28, when the angel Gabriel says to Mary, "Greetings, favored one," the word he uses in Greek is kekaratomene. And many will argue that this is where we get the idea that Mary was conceived without original sin, because kekaratomene means that Mary was filled with grace at a past point and that had a permanent and perfect effect. So that's where we get the idea that Mary was perfected, filled with grace at her conception, and that had a permanent effect, which seems to line up with the Quran verse that I just read, where it says that Allah has made Mary pure. But without the teaching of original sin, in what way can the Quran say that Mary was made pure? According to Ibn Kathir's tafsir or commentary on this verse, Mary was the most virtuous woman of her time, and she was chosen by Allah, quote, "because of her service to him, because of her modesty, honor, innocence, and conviction." And this is why several hadiths say that Mary, quote, "achieved perfection." Now, interestingly, this actually goes a bit further than Christians would in giving credit to Mary. Whereas Christians would say she was immaculately conceived, she was made perfect by God, the Quran seems to be saying, and the Hadith and Tafsir seem to be saying, that she earned this perfection in some way. Now, interestingly, there's also a Hadith that seems to affirm something like the Immaculate Conception. This is Sahih al-Bukhari 3431, which quotes Muhammad as saying, quote, "There is none born among the offspring of Adam, but Satan touches it. A child therefore cries loudly at the time of birth because of the touch of Satan, except Mary and her child." So here we have in Islam the teachings that Mary was protected from Satan, that she achieved perfection, she was chosen by God, and she was the best woman of her time. And Christians can also affirm these things, but with some nuances. So we could say, yes, of course, she was protected from Satan in that she was spared from having the stain of original sin. Not that she wasn't touched at birth or something, because we don't believe that that's why babies cry. But that's besides the point. Similarly, we would say she achieved perfection, but that perfection was really a gift from conception, and that she maintained that by cooperating with God when his plan for her was revealed. So she achieved perfection, but not through her own strength, but through the grace of God. We would also agree that she was chosen by God, not just to give birth to the Messiah or a prophet, but to give birth to God himself in the flesh. And then lastly here, where Islam says that Mary was the best woman of her time, Christians would say that Mary was the best woman of all creation. That's because she's the only woman to have the honor of actually carrying God in her womb and giving birth to him. And as Luke chapter 1 says, she is blessed among women, meaning she is the most blessed woman ever created. Now, the last area of agreement I want to talk about here is that Muslims and Christians agree that Mary is not a god. So while the Quran speaks very highly of Mary, as I've been covering here, it also criticizes Christians for treating her as a deity. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah 116, Allah questions Jesus, asking, quote, "Didst thou say unto mankind, take me and my mother for two gods besides Allah?" To which Jesus allegedly replies, quote, "It was not mine to utter that to which I had no right." Now, implicit in this verse is the accusation that Christians are treating Mary and Jesus as gods. Now, while of course we do affirm that Jesus is God, as the scriptures tell us, and as we have always affirmed since the first century, there is no evidence that any Christians in 7th century Arabia were treating Mary as a god. In fact, the closest thing we have to that is roughly 300 years before Muhammad in a sect called the Collyridians. And these were a group of Christians who were treating Mary as a god by offering her sacrifices of cakes. They were making cakes and offering them to her on altars. Now, this was never allowed in Christian teaching. This was never a thing that Christianity taught, and it was thoroughly condemned by Saint Epiphanius of Salamis in his work Panarion. So it seems that this accusation in the Quran is maybe a misunderstanding of Christian theology, or maybe there was a sect of Christians at that time in Arabia who did think that Mary was a god, and we just have no record of them. Either way, Christians and Muslims can agree that Mary is not a god and she is not to be worshipped. So all of this information tells us that there are a lot of ways in which Christians and Muslims agree about Mary. Muslims hold Mary in high regard, as Christians do, and Islamic texts affirm that Mary was a virgin when Jesus was conceived and born, that she was chosen by God for a very special purpose, that she was protected from Satan, and that she was made pure in some way. But interestingly, these things are understood differently in Christianity and Islam because of the theological underpinnings of each belief system. For example, while we would agree that Mary was chosen for a special purpose, Islam believes that that purpose was to give birth to the Messiah, whereas Christianity teaches that she was chosen to give birth to not only the Messiah, but to God himself. Whereas Islam teaches that Mary was pure, it teaches that she achieved this purity and perfection on her own account. Whereas Christianity would teach that she achieved this perfection with the help and grace of God. Whereas Islam would teach that Mary was protected from Satan at birth, we would teach that she was protected from Satan at conception in being free from the stain of original sin. And while both Muslims and Christians revere Mary, we revere her for different reasons. Muslims revere Mary because she gave birth to the Messiah, whereas Christians revere Mary because she gave birth to God himself. Ultimately, it's our Christology, our understanding of Jesus, that shapes our Mariology, our understanding of Mary. And until we agree on who he is, we're going to differ on who she is. And this is why, as I discuss in my playlist titled Defending the Marian Dogmas, it is very important what we believe about Mary because Mariology and Christology are intertwined. What you believe about Mary is going to shape what you believe about Jesus, and what you believe about Jesus is going to shape what you believe about Mary. There is no separating them. Anyways, I hope this was interesting. I know this was a little bit more of an in-depth video, kind of in the weeds theologically. So hopefully this was still entertaining and interesting to watch. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if you think I misrepresented something or I got something wrong. Please let me know. I'm happy to correct it. And as always, until I see you next time, God bless.